Azkaban was built by a dark wizard. Azkaban was never meant to hold prisoners. It was built for something worse. Centuries before the Ministry claimed it, Azkaban was the private fortress of a dark sorcerer named Ekrizdis. He captured muggles, tortured them for pleasure, and fed their suffering into the very walls of the island. When he vanished, the structure remained. So did the Dementors. No one dared approach for years. Then, the Ministry arrived. They didn't cleanse the place or destroy it. They turned it into a prison. Not because it was safe, but because it was already cursed. They allowed Dementors to stay, let them feed on inmates, and kept it all quiet. The public never knew its true origin. They only knew the fear. And fear was the point. Azkaban was never about rehabilitation. It was about erasure, the kind that leaves no trace, just silence and broken minds. Aurors were ordered to use dark magic. There was a time when the Ministry rewrote its own rules in blood. During the First Wizarding War, Aurors were granted the legal right to use unforgivable curses. Torture, control, and murder, all of it was approved. They didn't speak about it in public. There were no announcements, no debates. Just quiet permissions handed out behind locked doors. Crucio was used in interrogations. Imperius in tracking and surveillance. Avada Kedavra in the field. The Ministry called it a strategy, but what they created was a new kind of soldier, one who crossed moral lines with a badge still pinned to their chest. After the war, those permissions were revoked. No trial, no accountability, no healing. It was never about justice. It was about winning. And once it was over, the Aurors who carried that weight were told to forget. But spells like that don't just vanish. They stay in wand hands, in memories, in the quiet corridors where power decided pain was justified. How the Ministry made werewolves unemployable. The Ministry never needed silver bullets. It had laws. It didn't need to hunt werewolves in the forest. It simply kept them poor, hidden, and powerless. The Werewolf Code of Conduct, the Registry Act, and the anti-werewolf employment laws were all dressed up as safety measures. But what they really did was strip away opportunity. Remus Lupin lived with that every day. He was denied jobs, rejected from schools, and tracked like a criminal. Not because he had done harm, but because he might. The Ministry never tried to understand lycanthropy. It tried to contain it. And when containment looked too much like cruelty, it buried the paperwork. No repeal. Just silence. And silence let the prejudice keep breathing. They knew the prophecy, and they locked it away. Before Harry Potter was a symbol, he was a name on a prophecy. A secret vision spoken in a fragile voice during a job interview. That prophecy predicted the rise of a boy with the power to defeat the Dark Lord. And the Ministry knew. They stored it deep in the Department of Mysteries, not because it was too dangerous to know, but because it was too powerful to share. They didn't trust the public with the truth. They didn't trust Dumbledore with it either. So they locked it in a glass sphere. They let it sit in silence while Voldemort rose again. They never warned the wizarding world, never said his name, never admitted they were already holding the words that could have changed the war. And when the time came, they denied it. The prophecy wasn't just a secret, it was a strategy, one that placed control above consequence. Centaurs were never granted full rights. Centaurs live in forests. Not because they want to be hidden, but because they were never welcomed. The Ministry labeled them as beasts in official records. Just magical creatures with dangerous pride. And that label changed everything. It meant no representation in magical law, no land rights, no say in how they were treated. The Ministry offered them a choice: accept their place as inferior or be classified as a threat, and they chose isolation. And the Ministry took that as consent. But it wasn't. Centaurs are intelligent, organized, and deeply connected to ancient forms of magic. But when they asked for autonomy, they were denied. When they demanded protection, they were ignored. Even when they helped defend Hogwarts, the Ministry stayed silent. Centaurs were never part of the magical community by law, just part of the landscape. And that silence wasn't an accident. It was a policy. Muggleborn files existed before Umbridge. The Muggleborn Registration Commission didn't start with Dolores Umbridge. She just gave it a name and a podium. Long before Voldemort returned, the Ministry was collecting blood status data. Quietly, systematically. Birth records, school applications, family interviews, all filed, stored, and cross-referenced under departments labeled Public Registry and Education Oversight. The system was always there. When the Death Eaters took power, they didn't need to build a new system. They just opened the drawers. Umbridge used the records to summon Muggleborns, accuse them of stealing magic, and send them to Azkaban. But the infrastructure wasn't hers. It belonged to the Ministry. Her chair in the courtroom sat beneath the official seal. Her rulings were stamped and archived. And when the war ended, those files didn't burn. They were boxed, relabeled, buried deep in a room where truth went to suffocate. The registry wasn't an outlier. It was a reflection, a reminder that fear doesn't need a dark mark. Sometimes, it just needs permission. The Ministry's forbidden spell vault. The Department of Mysteries isn't the only place where the Ministry hides what it can't control. Deep in magical law archives and off-the-record research wings, there are spells that have never been published, curses that were never taught, and enchantments so dangerous that even speaking them is forbidden. Some of these spells were created during war. Others were found in ancient grimoires and studied by unspeakables. But not all were destroyed. Some were copied, stored, and later they were weaponized. The Ministry officially bans certain spells like the unforgivable curses, but it never disclosed every spell it tested, altered, or preserved. Some insiders believe the Ministry has developed counter-magic that borders on the same darkness it claims to fight. Experimental charm work, blood-based incantations, spells that manipulate memory, alter time, or fracture identity. None of it public, all of it hidden. Not because it's unknown, but because they know exactly how dangerous it is, and they would rather keep it close than let it fall into the wrong hands, even if sometimes those hands are their own. Dementors were allowed to breed. Dementors weren't just tolerated, they were cultivated. The Ministry used them as prison guards for centuries, pretending they were tools. But the truth is, Dementors are predators. They feed on despair, and the more they feed, the more they grow. The Ministry knew this. They watched their numbers increase. They built policy around it. Every soul left to rot in Azkaban became food. Every visit, every sentence, every execution meant nourishment. And then came the breeding. Quiet, unannounced, but undeniable. Dementors began to appear outside the island, in fields, near towns, near schools. Instead of ending the threat, the Ministry tried to manage it. They fed them fear, kept them leashed, and ignored the spreading cold. When the Dementors finally defected to Voldemort, no one was surprised. They had never been loyal. They were never tamed. The Ministry just let them grow in the shadows until the shadows took over. It wasn't a failure of containment. It was the cost of using monsters for convenience. Polyjuice espionage wasn't just for war. Everyone remembers Barty Crouch Jr. using Polyjuice potion to infiltrate Hogwarts. What most people forget is how often the Ministry did the same. Polyjuice wasn't just used by Death Eaters. It was used by Aurors, investigators, even senior officials. The Ministry called it surveillance, intelligence gathering, temporary impersonation in high-risk situations. But what it really was theft. Identity theft wrapped in parchment and red wax. Polyjuice allowed Ministry workers to enter homes under false names, to extract information without consent, to test loyalty without warning. In some cases, they didn't just copy the voice or face. They copied the habits, the family roles, the intimacy. Witches and wizards woke up to find someone else had worn their life for hours, and no one told them. There were no public reports, no investigations, just quiet approvals and shredded paperwork. The law says Polyjuice is a regulated substance, but the Ministry never regulated its own use. It just looked the other way when it needed to become someone else. The trace was selective by design. The trace is supposed to protect young witches and wizards, a magical marker that alerts the Ministry whenever underage magic is used outside school. But there's a flaw built deep into the system. It doesn't detect who cast the spell. Only that magic happened near a minor. That design choice wasn't an accident. It gave the Ministry room to accuse without proof, and it gave them room to ignore what they didn't want to see. Harry Potter was blamed when Dobby used a hover charm. He was nearly expelled after casting a Patronus in self-defense. Meanwhile, the Weasley twins used magic constantly at home without consequences. The trace was enforced inconsistently, and that inconsistency hit Muggleborns the hardest. In magical households, magic was everywhere, hard to trace, easy to excuse. But for Muggleborns, any spell was suspicious. Any incident became a case. The system wasn't broken. It was built to be biased, a tool dressed up as protection. And one more way the Ministry kept control while pretending to keep order. The Obliviator Department silenced witnesses. Obliviators are trained to erase memory. Officially, their job is to protect the statute of secrecy. If a Muggle sees a dragon, a flying car, or a dueling pair of wizards, the Obliviators step in. The spell is quick, but it wasn't just used on Muggles. Behind closed doors, the same charm was cast on witches and wizards. People who saw something they shouldn't have. A misfired experiment. A classified scroll. A piece of truth the Ministry didn't want repeated. Memory charms were performed without permission, without records. In some cases, the victims never even realized something had been taken. They just moved on, unaware that pieces of their own story had been stolen. Even inside the Ministry, lower-level workers were occasionally subjected to safety wipes. One minute you were sorting files. The next, you couldn't remember what day it was. The Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes called it protocol, but protocol becomes something else when it's weaponized. The truth doesn't need to be disproven if it can simply be forgotten. The Department of Mysteries might be worse than we think. No one knows what happens inside the Department of Mysteries. That's the point. It houses rooms dedicated to time, death, love, space, and thought. It is guarded more tightly than Gringotts, and even most Ministry officials are denied access. But there have always been rumors, whispers about what they do with the knowledge they keep, experiments that go too far, test subjects that never come back. The veil isn't just an object. It's a boundary between life and something else. And the unspeakables study it like a door waiting to be unlocked. There's the love room sealed permanently after an incident no one will explain. There's the Hall of Prophecy, filled with futures no one is allowed to hear. And then there are the things not listed on any floor plan. Hallways that don't lead where they should. Rooms that vanish. Files that burn on touch. The Department of Mysteries doesn't answer questions, it erases them. And the longer it stays hidden, the more likely it is that some of the Ministry's darkest secrets are stored not in files, but in people. Magical accidents that were buried. Not every magical disaster makes it into history books. Some are erased before the ink dries. The Ministry has entire teams dedicated to magical containment, but not just to prevent harm. Sometimes they step in after the fact, after a charm mutates, after a potion explodes, after a village disappears under a cloud of uncontrolled spellwork. There are stories of magical accidents in remote areas, entire communities affected, memory wiped, and rebuilt with a different name. The Department of Magical Accidents and Catastrophes has a subdivision that specializes in rewriting local records. They create fake maps, redirect travel, fabricate Muggle explanations. Some say entire wizarding families vanished after magical experiments went wrong, not killed, but relocated, silenced, or charmed into forgetting who they were. No one holds a hearing. No one demands an inquiry. Because if no one remembers what happened, then by the Ministry's standards, it didn't. They call it safety. But safety without truth is just a prettier kind of fear. They suspected Horcruxes and did nothing. The magic behind Horcruxes was never widely known. It was hidden for a reason. But someone inside the Ministry figured it out. Not the details, not the name, but the signs. Unnatural immortality, splintered magic, a pattern of destruction that followed Voldemort long before his return. Senior unspeakables in the Department of Mysteries tracked magical signatures they couldn't explain. Objects that radiated wrongness. Events that bent the magical field around them. They filed reports. They wrote theories. But those theories were sealed, marked too speculative for action. The Ministry didn't want to investigate further, not because they lacked evidence, but because evidence would require accountability. Once you name a Horcrux, you can't ignore it. And they weren't ready for that, so they kept quiet. Let Dumbledore carry the burden. Let Harry chase the pieces. And when the war was over, they took credit for peace they never earned. They feared the dark, but they feared the truth even more. Creature rights were actively undermined. The Ministry didn't just fail magical creatures, it used them. House elves were denied freedom, goblins were kept out of wand rights, and giants were driven into isolation. On paper, these were cultural differences. In practice, they were policies of exclusion and exploitation. House elves cooked, cleaned, and protected wizarding homes, but the ministry never passed laws to free them. When Hermione tried to raise awareness through SPEW, she was mocked, not just by students, by the system itself. Goblins were denied wand ownership, labeled inherently untrustworthy, and locked out of magical lawmaking. Meanwhile, they ran Gringotts. They protected wizarding gold with loyalty the ministry never returned. Giants were hunted, displaced, and smeared in newspapers. Their attempts at diplomacy were ignored. The ministry used their image to sell fear, then used that fear to tighten control. Magical creatures weren't beneath protection. They were beyond it. Not because they lacked value, but because the ministry never saw them as equals, only as tools, until the war made them enemies, or worse, collateral. This list is not complete. It never could be, because the most dangerous ministry secrets are still sealed, still hidden behind enchanted doors and official lies. There are vaults inside the Department of Mysteries no one speaks of, spells the Wizengamot classified and buried, entire magical events scrubbed from the record, left only in ghost stories and burned pages. The ministry controls information the way a skilled wizard controls a wand. Firmly, quietly, and with consequences. But magic doesn't forget, and neither do the people it hurts. The ministry may hold power, but power built on silence always cracks. It's not a question of if, it's when, because secrets don't stay buried forever. And when the truth finally surfaces, it won't come quietly. It never does.